welcome to Get Wet with Saray Johnson. This will be part of my Division 3, and some themes that we're going to be exploring in the first few episodes will be care and keeping of insertive sex toys, both biological and non-biological. Here defined as dildos, butt plugs, fingers, fists, and tongues. Sex after sexual violence, sex work in the LGBT community, the feminist sex wars and their impact on sexual practice, etc., etc. But today we'll be talking about topping and bottoming. Unfortunately, this is an issue that has been talked a lot about more in the gay male community than in any like female assigned or female bodied sort of space, particularly as scholarship and scholarly writing goes. But an interview with David C. Jones, who's an improv actor from the troupe Tops and Bottoms, talks very heavily about how it's adapted from both S&M culture and adopted from gay men culture. But the issue of topping and bottoming gained a lot of criticism during the feminist sex wars of the 1980s. So an article by Moskowitz, Rutger, and Roloff that uses methods by looking at a bunch of gay men's personals. Amongst gay men, the categories of top, bottom, and versatile reflect sex roles during anal intercourse primarily. But that study found that 75% of the men surveyed had accurate self-labels of their topping and bottoming almost 100% of the time. So the labels that people were imposing on themselves were actually correlating to sexual practices, which is not necessarily the same as like gender identity or like sexual orientation, which is why I found the topic so interesting to begin with. So also one of their hypotheses was that the label was derived from a more frequent enactment of one behavior over another. And that bottoms were the most likely to be mutable within that category, even more mutable than those who consider themselves switches or sexually versatile, which also kind of counteracts understandings of tops as particularly masculine or bottoms as particularly feminine, or as this is like an issue that's inextricably tied to gender. Although it is also often seen as a microcosm of larger power dynamics in a relationship. But these interviewers also ran into the issue of how acts that do not involve genital penetration fit into a conventional understanding of topping and bottoming. So I was going to open that up to questions or comments and concerns and the frightened faces of the audiences. But I know there's someone here that's brave enough to take that bait.
Wait, what was it again?
About how I was wondering how you guys felt about topping and bottoming in the context of something that's not necessarily directly penetrative, such as receiving fellatio or giving oral sex to a female assigned partner, for instance. Like, where does that even fit in on the spectrum of topping and bottoming? And does that like discount notions of our understandings of ourselves as like tops or bottoms? Like, for instance, like I identify as a bottom, not a power bottom, but definitely a pillow queen. And so like if I'm going to fuck someone, like that would, like with a strap on or with my fingers, like that necessarily would be a deviation from like what other people understood to be a bottoming activity.
I really like the phrase power bottom. I've never heard it before, but I feel like it adds, it just brings an interesting, dynamic to bottom being that like is not necessarily attached to bottoming. Like I don't know, not to like say that there's something not there, but it recognizes a power in it. That's neat.
Definitely. Well, for those of us who have heard the term power bottoming, like what is like the difference for any of us between bottoming and power bottoming? Because I know for me, like to be a bottom is to understand yourself to be a receptive partner, and to be a power bottom is to like fuck someone with an orifice, is to be like in a topping role as the receptive partner. Mm-hmm. So like that's what the difference between bottoming and power bottoming is to me.
Yeah, I've heard it thrown around a lot and never quite understood the difference. And like I tried to figure so that was a very clear like way to think about it.
I also think that power bottoming throws the entire act of bottoming into like really clear relief, because for me, the bottom is in charge during insertive sex too, or with the idea that the bottom runs the fuck, mostly because there are often higher risks to an orifice than to whatever you're inserting into it. During both vaginal intercourse and anal intercourse, and like and oral sex too. For cuts and tears, if you get fucked too hard, and then you have like problems, you can have develop problems with your cervix, or like have be a very like painful experience for things that are very sensitive. So I think that like power bottoming is something, or the concept reminds me that bottoms have to take charge in, or at least not give up their power in a situation in which they are the receptive partner.
If someone being a power bottom then like takes away the power of the top person, or if like the person who tops like then becomes like not so dominant, or if it stays having like that dominant like power dynamic too. I just think that that's like interesting to think about.
Almost like an equalizer.
Yeah.
I think that's definitely.
Does it equalize, or does like the top still have some kind of power, or
Like, are they still
does
the
it-
top?
Yeah.
do they lose that?
Or are there two tops in that situation? I think that's an interesting question.
There can be so much fluidity like within one sexual encounter, like a particular like time frame of a sexual encounter, and like having there be people like switching within that like sex act versus like across time. And I think that I don't know what I think about that, but just that exists in different ways.
I think the idea of a top and bottom over the course of a life is something that resists standardization almost completely, you know, or like even across the year, you know, like for people who might not be as staunch in one identity or the other, you know. And I think that especially, I also thought that one issue that was interesting that I didn't exactly know how to cover in like just me like speaking face to face thing is the gendered assumptions about who's a top and who's a bottom reflecting what people will say in public regardless of what they actually do. Like someone who is very butch telling everyone that they're a top when they're not a top, you know, like for like preservation of like a gendered understanding of like how sex is tied to gender. And I think like that's another way that like topping and bottoming becomes really complicated, because what you say is not always what you do, you know.
And there's like on that sense, there's always that phrase, not always, but there's the phrase butch on the streets, femme in the sheets, which is like a whole other like can of worms, I guess, about like gendered assumptions is like the other side of it. Yeah, I read something interesting about that phrase the other day, where someone was saying that like they had problems with it because they were like, oh, it assumes that like a butch person is always a top, and then it's like not okay for them to be bottom. But they didn't talk at all about how like at the same token it assumes that like femme people are always bottoms. And so I like thought it was interesting, like even in this person who identifies as like a butch top is like just deconstructing this statement, but like not like pointing out the cracks in it, but at the same time not pointing out the fact that like there's the other side of it that like assumes that like femme identified people are always bottoms. I don't know.
I also think that it is to be noted that like if you are a top or a bottom during partner sex or vanilla sex, you know, like you may like that might be a completely different dynamic than what happens if you do practice S&M. Like the ideas of top and bottom are not necessarily stationary across that either. But something else that I did find very interesting in the Roloff Mauskowitz Reiger article was that they broke it down into graphs by race. And then a whole different dynamic ensued, which I think was an interesting part of self-reporting. They interviewed 76 black men, and not a single black man said that he was a bottom. And I just think like that, and then every other group of men of color, Latino men that were surveyed, Native American men who were surveyed, and Asian men who were surveyed, unanimously said that they were bottoms or versatile, and none of them reported being tops. And I think like that era in self-reporting like reflects a lot of the understanding, like the racialized understandings of those categories in and of itself, and like how dominance and like a desire to be dominated plays into self-reporting whether or not you're a top or a bottom. And how like I've also been thinking a lot about how bodies dictate whether or not we feel like we can be tops or we can be bottoms. Whether or not that be like your body as it like pertains to your genitals, or your body as it pertains to your size or shape. For me, I know it like as it affects like my ability. I can't like take a lot of weight on me, or and also can't be in like a standing position or a position where I am carrying weight for a long time. So I think in a lot of ways, like I default to bottom for that reason. And I think like that, and I've heard like similar stories from people who share my ability level or have like similar disabilities to me, like be they chronic illness or arthritis, like rheumatoid swelling conditions of that sort, where like carrying and moving or moving a partner or moving yourself on a partner, it becomes like a non-issue almost, and like also issues of balance. So
it can also be an element of like wanting to work with whoever your partner is, so being influenced by, you know, not necessarily your partner, but the other person you're being intimate with or other people, you know, by their desires, and then the way that you take on your role of interacting with bottom tendencies or top tendencies or whatever. So recognizing that can have a really big effect on the way people perform sex acts, whether or not it's a different discourse in their head.
I also felt like at Hampshire, this issue of whether tops are really gay, bottoms are really gay came into play for me for like the first time in my life. I had more than one person tell me since I got here that bottoms aren't really gay, and that to be like truly gay, you must be an insertive, topish sex partner. Yeah, I've had more than one person.
Well, then who's on the bottom? Is that person?
Exactly.
That makes sense to me. I guess that explains something.
I mean, were they talking about like specifically like female assigned at birth who are like maybe queer or whatever? Because I feel like the other side of that, like people who are male assigned at birth often like are assumed to be gay if they're bottoms.
You know what? I had both a gay identified like male identified person and a female assigned person tell me that those are the people I was having the first conversation with.
Yeah, no.
At the time.
Totally. I mean, if you, I feel like I totally like I've encountered that like sentiment before in like my particular community of like the people that I date and like, you know, whatever. But I think that there's a tendency on the other side for like people who are male assigned at birth for people to assume that they themselves are always bottoms if they are gay if they are bottoms. Does that make sense?
Okay, yes, I do. Yeah. I understand what you mean.
It seems like we go through all these different eras, like where, you know, it's acts that define your sexuality, and then it's like, no, it's the way you present your gender, and like, what is gender? Like, it's just I don't really know how to phrase it. I just think it's interesting that it keeps changing and going back and forth.
For me, it's like kind of a holdover from like the like anti-sodomy laws, where like there was like an active and a passive participant, and like the bottom was like passive, so like wasn't as guilty of sodomy as like the other person. So they're just, I'm like, why are you still holding on to that? That's why I think that like talking about power bottoming is a very interesting like course of progression, because it's kind of like looking at what like reframing what it means to be like on the receiving end, not in terms of like being passive or like being like female bodied or being like, I mean, because I feel like it always goes into like when you're talking about like passive or like when you're a bottom people, there's like always like victimization kind of like on the fringes, and like that sort of like looking at power bottoming as like fucking with an orifice, or like it's also like an act of like not always giving complete power in a situation to like some kind of like phallic object, which is also like, you know, a holdover from like what does it like legally mean to be like engaging in like homosexual acts.
It was really interesting for you to talk about the ways that, you know, power bottoming disrupts the idea of victimization that often goes on with bottoming, because like I think that often in narratives of bottoming there's a lot of conversation about a bottom not being completely invested in the act, or being passive to the point of like it kind of being a scenario where it's just an orifice, like where if you are a partner on the bottom, you are just something to fuck, you know, like you are not a valid partner in that sense, you know, like you should be doing more, and that like active submission is not seen as taking an active role in sex.